afternoon, our esteemed viewers. This week, again, I'm back with a panel of esteemed gentlemen. Of course, we shall have a lady joining us in later on during the show. But on today's panel, I have a panel from Islamic University in Uganda, a gentleman called Magala Fred. I have a panelist from Nkumba University with the names Mr. Garang Lester, and then from UCU, Uganda Christian University, Kinobere Andrew. Today, we shall be dissecting on the topic, which is called US Africa Summit for Democracy, Recommendations for the Youth. So, before I go further, allow me give at least a few seconds for the panelists to introduce themselves as we dissect this topic and we enjoy the inter-university interface. Thank you very much. Fred, introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. I'm Magala Fred, that is my name, from Islamic University in Uganda, a third-year law student, and I'm honored to be here to dissect matters of democracy. For sure, I think we need to do a lot, speak a lot, and also put a lot into practice to uplift our country and our continent as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, Lester?
Yes, Douglas, thank you. My name is Garang Lester is always my name. I am a final year student of law at Nkumba University in Nigeria. And I am a very important person, like Douglas would want to say. But for this particular day, I will not say such things. I am a member of the East African Community Youth Ambassadors Platform for the Republic of South Sudan. I also serve as the head of the Politics, Peace and Security Committee of the same platform. And I am honored to speak about the US relations with Africa regarding the summit and then democracy and how it plays out. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Drake. My name is Kinobere Andrew Marvin. I'm a second-year law student This particular topic is one that must be talked about. Is one that we were supposed to have a discussion about even way before. So I'm glad to be here. This is my second time, and I'm really delighted for the opportunity, and I can't wait to discuss the matters and we'll see how to go about it.
All right, thank you very much. Our dear viewers, as you've seen, the panel is, as you can see, filled with very important people. And the very important people are going to help us dissect the topic today. So let's dive into the topic of discussion of US Africa Summit for Democracy, the recommendations for we the youth. We know Africa is the youngest continent in the world with a median age of 14.9. And that means being the youngest continent in the world means we have to, engage in democracy, engage in the process of decision-making, among others. But particularly on the US Africa Summit, one that was just concluded in the month of March. And we have seen that the number of recommendations that were put henceforth in Lusaka, Zambia, one that was looking on youth engagement in democratic process and spaces. There's one that looking at media freedom and expression, among others. To start off this conversation, allow me begin with Garang Lester quote. Garang, in unpacking this conversation, how would you describe the state of democracy and civil society in Uganda in relation to the recommendations for the youth of Africa?
Oh, okay, so thank you, Douglas. I think it's a very interesting way to begin because I think when you look at the recommendations and then you look at Uganda and you juxtapose the two, you will be able to realize that it appears that the recommenders were speaking directly to Uganda on media freedom, firstly, secondly on the state of democracy, and then maybe lastly on the participation of young people in politics in the country. And when you speak about the population and how young the African population is, Uganda particularly sits within the center of such conversation because about 78% Ugandans are below the age of 35. So that means a lot of this country's population is young people. Now, with that number of young people, there is a huge gap between the leading and the led, because if you look at the age of the people that lead us, it speaks to just one thing. A chunk of the population which is young is being led by a very old people. So there's a generational gap between the leading and the led. So that means when The recommendation is to the extent that participation of the youth within politics, within decision making, within the civic spaces is a recommendation. That is why I began by saying that that spoke to Uganda, because it appears to be telling the leadership of Uganda that there is a particular dire need to include young people within how they are led, because they're the biggest people. And also the Ugandan population of young people is also not something that you can underrate, because they have begun to understand the importance of their voices within civic conversations.
True.
And these are things you can see with the events that happen when there are issues with how leadership is structured. They are always very loud in calling out leaders on social media, or even sometimes physically through demonstrations, which sometimes turn chaotic. But that is like an expression of discontent, an expression of check and balance on how we are led. So the interpretation from that is to tell that old people are leading us, but we still want them to lead us the way we want. We can actually shorten that whole conversation by simply involving young people in leading, so that they don't ask on how to be led, they participate on how to be led. But on democracy, I think Uganda has had a long period of time practicing a rudimentary form of democracy that I don't think at a time like now should be what we categorize as democracy. Because like, what is democracy, Douglas? I think democracy was on three fundamental principles: principle of accountability, the principle of participation, and representation. So while we appear to be represented, can we participate in the democratic structures? How is the participation? Participation is speak to what I said first. If young people are not part of the conversations and decision making, you can't say they are participating. There's always an argument that, okay, we elect leaders, we elect members of parliament, we elect members of the executive by speaking like that, maybe the president. But yes, we don't stop at electing if we have to be participative in dictatorship, because in democracy, because at the end of the day, can we hold the people we elect to account? That is where the problem comes in for Uganda particularly. So I think the kind of democracy that Uganda is practicing, of holding regular elections, free or fair, I can't speak to that now, but elections happen, that is not a democracy, because what happens after an election? Do we hold the leaders we apparently elect to account? So that is something that is very, very important to begin with. But then lastly, on media freedom, I think Uganda has had a track record of flawed media, because while media is supposed to be absolutely free, you cannot argue the same thing in Uganda, because even media houses, to the way they report, because you see the way we take in information from media houses is very open for one to know that there is some form of independence that is lacking, because you can tell that someone is reporting and they are scared of how they proceed. If you see what happened very recently to the African Institute of Investigative Journalism, and because of just a very interesting story that I thought government would find interest in being published, an investigation of that sort, they had issues with government, and then they had issues with where they were hosted because of government sabotage and so many other things. Journalists have been harassed. People have been called out because of reporting some things that apparently should not be reported. I don't know why there exist things that cannot be reported in a country with ostensible media freedom as it appears. So I think Uganda was the target audience for those recommendations. Yes.
All right, fair enough. It's interesting how Garang makes his argument and says that this particular recommendation speaks to the heart of Uganda in terms of the flawed media. He gives us examples of how we have repressive laws and people do not have freedom of expression, in terms of a lack of inclusion, and yet we are the second youngest. Uganda is the second youngest country in Africa after Niger. So that is what he says, and that is what he argues. So from that, Mr. Fred Magala, I would like you to describe, we have seen a number of militarized governments in Africa. In Uganda, some would argue we have a militarized government. We have seen in some parts of Sudan earlier on. We saw in countries in Central Africa, among others. Speak to the heart of militarized politics and how it affects democracy. Or do you think militarized politics is possibly a way of harnessing or fostering service delivery?
Thank you. To begin with, most of the African countries are heterogeneous in nature. we have different tribes, we have people of different origins within these countries. And we have seen that if you look at their kind of politics, we always have that dominant tribe or that dominant sect within those countries. And the moment such get into power, they don't want to get off it. What does it call for? In order to sustain power, to stay in power in different African countries, you need to control the military. You need to have the gun at your back. You need to have the gun within your hands. You need to have the gun at your doorway. I think with that, you all agree with me. Particularly, if we come back to Uganda here, I've never seen a Katikkiro or Prime Minister of Uganda being a Munyankole. What does that speak to us? That the moment a given figure gets into power, will first and foremost make sure that he brings his own people on board. Bringing them on board how? We find out that now they start dominating the military, a military as a tool of staying into power. So, militarization of different governments in Africa is not based on service delivery, majorly. It is majorly based on how to stay in power.
Power retention.
Power retention. On how to win over the rest of the tribes or societies within such a country. And after doing this, what do? Now they want to dominate all the sectors. Because what are the best characteristics we can talk about military governments? First and foremost, most of them are corrupt. Why? Because there is no check. If the parliament is there, the parliament will be there as, I don't know, a point of reference that there is some kind of democracy, but nothing can go on. We have had people that have been bailed out, and at the entrance of court, they are rearrested with no arrest warrant, with no nothing. We have had people that are getting different government contracts, not because they match the quality of the persons we want to give them, but because their relatives are military personnel. We have had ministers being appointed, yet they are still serving officers. What does that speak to us as Africans, as Ugandans?
On that point, where you say we have ministers that are appointed you have ministers that are appointed and yet they're serving officers. You're a student of law. How does that speak to the heart of the power of separation of powers?
Well, that is a question of interpretation. Well, if you look at our segmentation as regards power, the UPDF falls under the executive. And if we have army officers being ministers, it means they have to sit in the house. Am I right?
True.
So I think we go back to absoluteness. There cannot be absolute separation of powers, but there shall always be checks and balances. But in Uganda, in Africa, that is not used in its genuinity, but we use it in order to make sure that we at least curb what the representatives are bringing on board. Why am I saying like that? If I'm not mistaken, it is not even 2 years back where we saw the army storming the parliament. Was it necessary to interfere with the people that have been voted into power to represent the majority in the decision making? And when it comes to the time of voting, you want to put off these people from the parliament. Why? Why should the army interfere with the parliament? We'll go back to the ethics of military governments.
All right. Thank you very much. Allow me engage with Andrew from just where you have stopped. He says that militarized politics in Africa is not used for service delivery. Rather, it's used for the retention of power. He further argues that if we use it for the retention of power, I raise the concern on the issue of separation of powers. And then he brings out the institution of parliament. Andrew, from that particular point, here we are describing the state of democracy and civil society in Africa. Speaking from the institution of parliament, we know parliament has a mandate and power to go ahead and pass and make laws, right? Now, we have seen governments go ahead and pass repressive laws that possibly go ahead and step on civil society and even step on rights of individuals. Kindly unpack for us and describe for us the repressive laws that we have experienced or that we have seen in Uganda and in many African countries, and how this has affected civil society and young people at large.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. I'm very glad that you've asked me this because as a person, for the time at least I've lived, I've not seen anywhere in this world where we have had a military regime succeed in the way it does work without negatively affecting the people. Yes, and that is what is happening. I can say that is what is happening in Uganda. First and foremost, when you have military regimes that are trying to consolidate themselves in power, we have seen this in Uganda several times with Idi Amin. Yes, and I would like to say that even with the current regime, that when there is need for them to pass maybe their laws, with Amin we had the decrees, they are going to use the military to pass these laws. That is, first of all, degrading what the institutions that are put there to do. You get, when you have an institution like Parliament, what is the role, the major duty of Parliament as an institution of the government? It is to make laws. Yes, to make laws because in Parliament there's a presumption that the people that are in Parliament or the people sent to Parliament are going to represent the majority of our ideas. Yes, so if we send people to Parliament, we expect to have an impartial Parliament, a Parliament that is not going to be infiltrated by the executive and all other arms. Yes, that is what makes a Parliament a Parliament. Yes, so when you have the military and all these other organs, yes, coming and infiltrating Parliament, it is then depleting what the Parliament is there for. Yes, in Uganda particularly, we have had instances where the military has, I don't know, I can't call it making laws, or I can't call it enforcing laws, because even with enforcing laws, that is not their function. Yes, the function of the military is far different from what is being done in Africa and in Uganda particularly. Yes, for example, we have seen civilians being tried in the martial court. How logically, even logically, it's not, it doesn't make any logical sense. Yes, for someone who doesn't even know how to hold a gun, how that person is going to be tried in a military court just because this person is against a repressive regime, or the person is exercising his freedom of speech. Yes, if that was the case, then some of these rights should then be removed from the constitution. Because if someone is going to come out and protest on something, and because this person has protested on something, you're just going to get a pile of charges that have no base and put them on them and then charge them in the military court, then that is affecting, it has an impact by implication on the fundamental rights of the people. Two, we saw, I don't want to over talk about it, but we saw when the POMA was rather enacted. Yes, the POMA, it's with no doubt prima facie from the face of things that the POMA was a political act. Yes, I would want to say that it was a political act, and in that act, though it wasn't mentioned anywhere, the intentions or the ideologies that were behind that act were to affect some of these freedoms that people are supposed to enjoy. Yes, and who are going to enforce this act? The military, the Uganda police. Yes, of course, when the military is talking, the Uganda police has no say, because in Uganda the military has taken the position of the police, and with that, now we are now seeing that first and foremost, even before we go into the military taking the role of the police, yes, or infiltrating Parliament, we have to first look at the quality of these military people. Yes, these are people who are first and foremost underpaid. They are not paid well. Secondly, they are also working under instructions. Here we have a certain hierarchy of people. Yes, we have former military officers who are actually summoning ministers. You get? So I don't know how much sense that makes. But you cannot tell me that a minister who is serving, yes, they've been appointed into office for not more than 3 years, is being summoned by a former military officer to come to, not even to their office, but to their home to answer some questions. You get? And with even these orders that we call orders from above, it is all depleting the institution of parliament. For example, when the office of the IGG passed a law that the military people should declare their wealth, so as MPs, which is right. It's just logically right, yes, in the actual sense that these people who are being given government money, who are handling people's money from the from taxpayers' money, they should declare their wealth, because we don't want people playing around with our money. But then you come up, because it's an order from above, and you're telling us the military shouldn't, people from the military shouldn't declare their wealth. Why? Then they should be paid maybe from donations. Let them be paid from donations, non-taxpayers' money.
All
Yes.
right. All right, Andrew, I hear your concern. And thank you for those very touching arguments. Allow me first to engage with you, Fred. Fred, you brought out the argument of militarized politics and how militarized governments look at retaining power and not actually delivering service. So I wanted to look at it from the perspective of civil society organizations. You know, civil society organizations are one that is supposed to go ahead and do a little bit of check into government laws, supposed to go ahead and also offer accountability to members of the society in their nature of work. And yet, picking a case study of Uganda passed in their laws, the NGO Bureau and the laws that govern NGOs in Uganda, we see repressive laws that give very stringent policies on civil society organization. What does this do to civic space? How does this affect democracy? And if yes, it actually affects democracy, what does it mean for the young aspiring leaders such as yourself?
Thank you. Part of the recommendations was that at least let the civic space and the sanctions that have been put on it be recalled or retracted. If you look at militarized governments, particularly if you look at Uganda, anything we look at as a threat, we shall get a way, whether formal or informal, to curb it. Now, this was brought from backside, looking at different non-government organizations, because all civic spaces are funded most of the times by non-government organizations. So, in a guise of telling you to declare your sources of money, that is one. Two, what you're going to use the money for. And three, what are you here to do? If the kind of sensitization you're going to give in Uganda, if the kind of space you're going to create is to critique and check and hold the government accountable, trust me, even if it is for a genuine cause, you're going to be halted somewhere, somehow. A lot of organizations, a lot of civic spaces, the money to fund them and help them run their activities has been withheld. Why? Because one day, one time, on a certain program, seated somewhere with the youth, they had to critique the government. They had to critique someone's son for saying things that were not worthy, for saying things that were literally putting down the press. More on that still. If you look at the press right now and the civic spaces, all of them, they will always want you to say what they want to hear. They always want you to say what is in their support, whether wrong or right. That is why we are seeing certain media houses being supported and others not being supported. We are having movements sprouting up, but these movements will only gain the public know if at all they're in support of the government.
True.
The civic spaces have been impeded from even infiltrating into different institutions. Why? Because the more they go into the institutions, the more they empower the youth and let the youth know that they have the authority over their country, over their rights, over their tomorrow.
All right. Thank you.
Many of us have sat down on what we can because of one thing. We have no person to tell us you can. We have no person to tell us you have the voice. We have no person to come down in our institutions and tell us, you know what, you can even elevate yourself from here. I'm proud that we are here, and basically us, we can know that we can engage in the fight democratically and in a way that is well nurtured to fight and at least revamp our nation.
All right, thank you. Lester, you said that democracy denotes to representation, participation, and accountability. And you assert that since Africa is the youngest continent in the world, you said the recommendation speaks to the heart of Uganda. And you said in Uganda, the youth are not engaging in decision making. You brought up arguments of a flawed media. Now, we have human rights, yes, human rights that ought to be respected. And for you, the human rights scholars, there's a paradigm they use to determine whether human rights have been respected. That is participation, accountability, non-discrimination, respect of rule of law, and yes, and inclusion. From that, we know that African countries are privy to very many international instruments that uphold human rights. But particularly, I'm going to focus, since we're dissecting democracy in Africa, I'm going to focus on the African Charter of Human and People's Rights. This particular act or this particular charter, this particular instrument is considered one of the most progressive human rights instruments in the world. Now, my question to you is, how well have African countries respected human rights? Or in a broader sense, how well have African countries respected this particular instrument vis-a-vis rule of law in recommendations that we saw that the US-Africa Summit are giving to the youth?
Okay, so thank you very much once again. I think it is important to first underscore the vulnerable position that international law occupies because of lack of direct enforceability, whether it is the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, whether it is the UN Charter, whether it is the Geneva Convention, or any other international instrument. You will notice that the position they occupy is very vulnerable to the extent that countries can freely sign up or ratify these treaties and then go ahead to perform other things. Perhaps for PR or for anything, they just appear to have ratified them and then go ahead to do what suits the governments in their place. So international law inherently lacks a metric of enforceability.
True.
It is not like the Penal Code Act or the Police Act or any act within the context of municipal law, where if you violated an instrument, you will be tried in the court of law if it is criminal or civil, or someone brings you before court. That you cannot say about international law. But that in mind, it does not give African countries or African governments the leverage to do the things that they do. And before I even make that argument, it is important that I underscore that the performance of most African countries, especially the military-led African countries, on the metric of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights or the UN Charter, or within even their state, for example, our Chapter 4 is deplorable. And that is sad to say the least. Because one, it doesn't make any logical sense or even a political mature sense that you ratify a treaty or you make a law and then you depart fundamentally. The key word is fundamental, because sometimes human error exists and you can't be absolutely correct. But if you depart fundamentally, it ceases being an error. It becomes an intended action. For example, the actions of governments like the government of Uganda cannot be said to be a couple of errors. Those are some intentions that are motivated by motives that we sometimes know or even we may not know. So human rights in the context of the time, and I will keep referring to the times because there is a difference between us, the people of 2023, and the people of 50 years ago. There were things that were still developing. Even now, there are things that are still developing, but I don't think the time we are in, it's time to still be having conversations on human rights, because even several parts of the world are beyond that. There are things we can do, and then there are things we should have done a long time ago. By appearing democratic, we should have had a metric that makes it possible to govern and lead within the scope of human rights. But we don't have that. We perform very badly in several rankings of human rights because of how human rights violations are evident. Even during our elections, the oppression that exists is terrible. But even with outside election, the participation of different groups of people within the political space is a metric for human rights, like you rightly pointed out.
Yeah.
So if the participation of the opposition figures, the participation of civil society organizations is directly limited and intentionally limited, it becomes something intended to go against the scope of human rights. So while the African Charter on Human and People's Rights is a progressive instrument within the context of our countries in Africa, or even in Uganda, in most African countries that even ratified it, because I think the progressiveness cannot be judged on the ratification. People, yes, ratified it, but then are they practicing it? This is not exclusive to Uganda. You can look anywhere, even if you look at Northern African countries. Look at countries like Tunisia. Look at countries like Algeria. Look at countries like Nigeria, for example, and several other countries. You'll notice that the human rights position is particularly vulnerable. So I think as a continent, we need to sit again and decide to be honest with ourselves. There are things that we can do even within the scope of law, whether international or municipal. You can maintain a regime if you want to within the scope of human rights respect and human rights law. But I don't think that is something that our military leaders want to engage. And I want to conclude with something that the gentleman spoke about, that is the military regimes and then the participation of civic space. It is hard, Douglas, and you will notice this. It is hard for a military regime that has been intentionally premised on the ideas of militarism to still be inclusive to civil society organizations, because directly the activities of the civil society organizations do not conform to their principles of militarism. The intentions of the military regimes are to maintain power, consolidate and maintain power. To maintain power, you have to keep people directly politically ignorant. A politically aware populace will not tolerate the nonsense that goes on within the military regimes. So you have to keep them politically ignorant, which is something that the civil society wants to deconstruct. The reason why people are engaging in political conversations is to empower the population to engage with knowledge within how they are governed. That is something the military regimes do not want to happen. But secondly, they want to keep them economically impoverished. The poor person is the one you can convince with a yellow t-shirt to vote. You cannot do that for someone who knows they have enough to eat. But because I know if I don't get that 5K or 2K to get a Chikomando along the road, I am most likely going to have a bad day. I will simply take that t-shirt or that 5K and vote as I am instructed. That you cannot do in a society that is economically empowered. So economic disenfranchisement and political ignorance, which are things that the regimes of the nation directly does, are the things that civil society wants to deconstruct. Because what does civil society do? Empower you to have entrepreneurial skills so that you can make something of yourself. Empower you to have civic knowledge so that you can engage in how you're governed. That is where departure comes from. And I think within the military regimes, civil space will always be limited, and that is something sad to always say. Yeah.
All right, Garang, you bring very powerful arguments. Allow me just stick with you for a minute. You bring up arguments that ignorance is among the factors that are leading to the failures of democracy in Africa.
Absolutely.
And you also mentioned the aspect of poverty, which is a very huge challenge across the continent. While we're cognizant of the fact that the challenges in the African continent are different, I want you to help us unpack, particularly, what are those barriers that affect the success of democracy in Africa?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because I can write a whole dissertation on that question, but for today I'll just speak a couple of things. I already spoke about poverty. It is hard for poor people to hold their governments to account because already they are at a vulnerable position. I usually have a better way to say it, that in relationships, even if there are relationships between you and your government, the one that needs the other more is vulnerable. We need the government more than they need us. Government needs us only 5 years down the road for us to vote for them. When that is done, we need them to provide health services. We need them to have a stable economy. We need them to have roads without potholes. We need them for so many things. So whenever we need them, we are at a very vulnerable position to plead with the things we need from them. I don't think that should happen in a democratic space. So if you are economically empowered, you can make some decisions for yourself, including decisions of where to live. There are people in this country that would have left the country if they had the means, because people don't see the future beyond where they exist right now. So poverty is critical in terms of limiting the implementation of, or effective implementation of democratic governance. But secondly, information. Information is highly limited, and for this very one, I am going to step on toes. I don't think the way we are taught is intended to capacitate us civically.
True.
And that's something very, very, very critical. Look at the curriculum. Look at the kinds of things that people are taught. I don't think an entire education can exist without some intentional intervention on civic awareness. Of course, there's a couple of things that we study in SST about what is democracy. I think in 2023, democracy should be beyond that. I think it should be deeper than that. But then proceeding, also above that, the kind of accountability metrics that exist are important, because it is one thing to know how to hold your government to account, and it is another to have the means to hold your government to account. The IGG's office is ostensibly meant to be an accountability metric, which sometimes conforms to the same government. You can't be an IGG if you contradict the principles for which the government or the regime or the movement to that extent wants you to perform by. So that is another problem. Even the parliament in and of itself is meant to be an accountability metric, because we elect people to the parliament to say the things we want them to say. When they get there, those things cease to exist. The parliament is predominantly partisan to the extent that the ideals that push them are ideals of political parties that send them there. Whether you have come from the ruling government or you have come from opposition parties, firstly, it is the party first, and then you yourself second. Perhaps the constituency can come third or fourth. That is tragic, because, I mean, I voted for you. I should come first. It doesn't happen in this country. That's the problem. So if you don't have means to hold to account, how many times, Douglas, as your member of parliament, called you for a town hall meeting to get your views so that they take them to parliament?
Do they?
The last time that happened, people were given money to go and consult on whether we should remove age limit. Those guys did not come to consult us. I don't know where they went, but they removed the limits. You see the problem? A member of parliament should have an engagement with their constituency to have healthy conversations about the things that affect them. For example, if my member of parliament came today, I'll tell them that my road is terrible. And then I expect them to go to parliament and advocate for budgeting, including the road budget that come to my road. So it is, and this is something also important to deconstruct. And this is a thing that comes from how ignorant we are. We think that members of parliament owe us some form of action. The only thing they owe us is policies that favor us. These guys do not pay for our weddings. They don't pay school fees for our kids. They are not even supposed to steal iron sheets for us. They don't do that. What they are supposed to do is to advocate for policies that favor us. If the economy is bad, the policies should change. If anything else is bad, those things should come in. So within that space alone, I think, like I said when I began, I could write a thesis for this, but for now, those things are just the biggest problems with our democracy.
It's all right. It's all right. You raise very huge concerns. Andrew,
Yes.
we are still here dissecting the barriers that have, we're still dissecting the barriers to democratic success in Africa. And Garang mentions, he mentions poverty, he mentions lack of information. And let's say we have all the information at our hand, the poverty has been eradicated, which I believe is impossible. In Africa, the biggest challenge that many African countries are facing is that vice called corruption. Money is allocated for the greater good, is used for individual gain. How does, or show to us how corruption has eaten up democracy or the success of democracy in Africa?
Thank you very much. Now, first and foremost, Uganda, as it has already been established, the majority of our population is made up of the youth. Yes, allow me to say this, Drake. Uganda, as a country, Uganda is a funny country. And as
sorry to say, but you're saying Uganda is a funny country. You're Ugandan.
Yes, I'm a Ugandan. I'm a Ugandan, and I'm so patriotic. I love my country. So I should say this with a lot of pain. Uganda is a funny country. We as the people, majorly the youth, some are funny people, allow me to say that. And by implication, we are making the country even more funnier. Now, look at this. When there's something that is happening in this country, yes, be it political, be it what, where do Ugandans rush first? Twitter. Yes, Ugandans love Twitter so much. something will go trending. Oh my God, something has maybe happened or what. Very, very funny things, and they'll go and make a lot of jokes about it. Previously, we had the Mabati saga. When Ugandans heard that, hey, ministers that have stolen iron sheets and what, they went to Twitter, they made a lot of jokes. Oh my God, if you go to Twitter and there's something trending in Uganda, you can laugh until your data is done. Yes? But why do I say this? Why do I start with such something that is so painful? The fight against corruption. Yes? First of all, the fight against corruption should be first fought by the urge to normalize it. Yes? In Uganda, we have normalized a lot of things. Yes? But the fight against corruption shouldn't be normalized. Because if we don't normalize corruption, we are not going to look at it as a normal thing. Yes? If we don't normalize corruption, we are going to disregard it like the way other countries that are developed have disregarded it. Yes? So Ugandans are normalizing corruption, and by Ugandans, since the majority are the youth, I'm talking about the youth. When you talk about corruption in Uganda, we are going to make a joke about it. Why? Because it has become something normal, but that shouldn't be the case. You know, we shouldn't sit down and look at our money, which we wake up in the morning, you go somewhere and maybe pay taxes and buy something that is heavily priced because of taxes. We go to university, we are paying a lot of tuition because the government is taxing 30% of us in private universities. And then with a corruption saga with our money, people are laughing about it. You get? So only that has made some of these vices to continue. Because you can't tell me that someone can go and steal billions of money, yes, when they know that they are not going to, something big is not going to happen. Why? Because the people are funny. They know someone knows is going to go and steal a lot of money, but at the end of the day, they are going to talk about it. Opposition MPs are going to go and make noise around, and then at the end of the day, someone is going to walk away like it's no man's business.
Andrew, you primarily focus on Uganda as a country.
Yes.
Uganda as a country, we know that oftentimes when something amiss happens, Ugandans are fond of running on social media, making jokes about it, and nothing is done about it. I want you first to, let us take a look at Rwanda. Rwanda as a country, the government does not tolerate corruption. If you are a corrupt official, you definitely have to resign and you're taken in what? In prison. Would you then therefore suggest that many African countries, inclusive of Uganda, should adopt draconian measures?
Of course, they should, if that is what it's going to take to fight corruption, because corruption is the biggest vice to development. Yes, if that is what is supposed to, if what is being done in Rwanda is what should be done to other countries to fight corruption, then let it be done. Because I would rather be in a country where there are stringent measures on corruption, yes, than be in a country where it's all relaxed and we are suffering the way we suffer. In Uganda here, you can't tell me of a road that has no potholes. Why? Because these people are giving us substandard work. Because something has to come back to the pocket. So if that is what should be done, then let it be done. Because now for example, here in Nigeria Nigeria is one of the most corrupt countries on this continent. If it's not the most corrupt, it's one of the most corrupt countries. To an extent that when the country was pulling out candidates for presidency, the three contestants, the Buharis and what, they are ranked one of the most corrupt people in Nigeria. Yes, and these are people we are putting into power. Yes, so now the applicability. Rwanda is lucky that they got someone who was passionate about the country, someone who from the start wanted development. Yes, I must say that.
I think on Rwanda's case we shall argue.
I must be, no, but what are you going to argue with? There's development. They're hosting FIFA.
Allow me ask a question.
We're struggling with building.
Allow me ask a question before I bring in Mr. Fred.
Yes.
You say that Rwanda is among the luckiest countries. Yes, they might be lucky that they're not facing the vice of corruption.
Yes.
Speaking to the heart of human rights, particularly in Rwanda, human rights is one aspect of our being as human beings that ought to be respected. And for us to go ahead and have, as Garang argued, that democracy denotes to representation, participation, and accountability. in a country whereby people's rights are not respected, where people are not allowed to speak freely, how would you then therefore argue that the people in that country are happy?
Now, thank you very much. Now, Drake, let me ask you a question and then I answer your question. Would you rather be in a country that is developed, where the leader is stuck onto power, yes, but the country is developed and there's no corruption?
Right.
Or would you rather be in Uganda that has a lot of corruption,
but
the leaders have refused to leave power, yes, the country is becoming, it's a mess.
It's all right. I will leave that to the viewers to decide.
On this very one,
Yes.
maybe before Fred comes in.
Yes.
I think the choice of the democracy also includes people having the choice of what kind of leadership to have. If the people of Rwanda have traded off their fundamental human rights to some extent for development, which they are proud of, and they make that choice by themselves, that in and of itself is democracy. People of Uganda have not had that chance. And that is the problem.
And we are suffering.
It's all right. For now, before Mr. Fred comes in, we shall go for a short commercial break. And when we come back, we'll start with you, Mr. Fred. As you can see, the conversation is hot and it's interesting. See you in a bit.
Digital rights are those human rights and legal rights that allow individuals to access, use, create and publish digital media or to access and use computers, other electronic devices and telecommunication networks. Digital rights include a right to freedom of expression, information and communication through technology, a right to privacy and data protection, a right to credit for personal works, a right to universal and equal digital access, a right to identity, a right to anonymity, a right to be forgotten, and a right for protection of minors, among others. The state's digital rights are frequently violated through various unfair actions, for example, blockage of websites and social networks, theft of credentials, unauthorized use of people's data for personal gain, privacy intrusion, online censorship, arrests and intimidation of online users, internet blockages, and the proliferation of laws and regulations that undermine the potential of technology to drive social, economic, and political development worldwide. It is hence every citizen's responsibility to respect rights of other digital users and to speak out or report to the responsible parties when one's rights are violated.
Well, welcome back from that short commercial break. Right before we went into that break, we are still dissecting the problems or vagaries or challenges that bury the democratic success in Africa. So right off, Andrew was arguing that corruption is one of the biggest barriers that has failed many African countries from achieving democratic success. So Andrew mentioned an argument that in Uganda, when Ugandans are facing challenges, they go ahead and put it on Twitter. From his argument, allow me bring out the aspect of digital rights. We understand that we live in a time whereby social media informs government. Social media is part of the democratic process. And we know that in various African countries, we have seen shutdowns of the internet. In Uganda, we saw it in Nigeria. It also happened in Zambia, among other African countries. Now, Mr. Fred, kindly help us dissect how bad digital interference is to the aspect of democracy in Africa. Possibly you can use Uganda or any other country that you know of in terms of informing democracy.
Thank you, Mr. Drake. Particularly, I'll start from my own country, Uganda. I love it. As Mr. Kinobere said, it is funny. Imagine at a time when we are compiling the results of a national election, and then all of a sudden the internet is down countrywide. Imagine a country where you put up your post as regards your own expression regarding a certain political matter, and the next day you are taken off with a numberless drone. We call it drones, a vehicle. And later on, we only get to know that you are taken by an agency that we don't know, because the police will disown you. They will say we don't have him. The army will say we don't have him. Every kind of agency will disown you. What am I trying to draw your attention to? That a lot of digital rights infringement has been used to target different activists and also citizens that have different ideas that are critiquing the government, its policies, and its way of handling things. If we draw back to the elections, people that were moving with the presidential aspirant, that is Robert Chagulanyi Sentamu, all those ones that were holding cameras and following him while recording live sessions on Twitter, Facebook, say it, most of them were beaten off. Most of them, as regards their platforms and their pages, were taken down. Where does this leave our democracy? Because democracy as a right, democracy as a principle does not go alone. In order to sustain and also bring democracy on board, you need to respect other rights, such as expression, press, movement. Now, if you don't respect my right of expression, how am I going to use the media? If I say something, of course, you just beat me up. If you don't respect my right of movement, how am I going to follow up the aspirant I'm supporting in order to make sure that the whole country views what he's saying or how he's carrying on his campaigns?
Okay, hang on. Do you then therefore think that this US-Africa Summit for Democracy, the recommendation they have, particularly on media freedom and free expression, do you think, or is it possible for us to achieve or implement these recommendations as per the summit?
Mr. Garang was very clear. The recommendations straight speak to Uganda. But the question goes back to implementation.
But how about other African countries?
Do you know why we're saying it's straightly speaking to Uganda? Because we have seen, we have experienced it, we have seen it. That's why we're saying it is. Imagine one television station to broadcast election results. Why don't you allow the others?
So in short, it is not implementable and achievable in Uganda.
It is not. Why is it not achievable? Why is it not implementable? The issue is that Uganda is not a democratic country as we assert.
So what are the solutions?
It is a military government. What are the solutions to military governments?
It's okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Allow me engage with you, Lester. You know that we have seen countries like Ghana and Somaliland in the year 2022. Their rankings or their score in terms of freedom spiked up. For us students who do law, we know that Somaliland has had a number of history in terms of violence and instability. Seeing that its rankings going up, it's something that is it's quite something to applaud. But then my question is, what factors do Africa's emerging and vulnerable democracies all possess?
So Africa is a continent of about 54, 55 countries.
Yeah.
So and they are not at the same level of growth, whether politically or economically. So I think there are two categories I want to speak to. There are those that are progressive, especially when I mean progressive in the sense that in governance you can be able to track a human rights record that is growing. You mentioned of Ghana, you mentioned of Somaliland. So Somaliland is a very interesting country because it's a country that grapples with even recognition.
State recognition,
exactly.
International law, yeah.
And that has nothing to do with how it's governing itself. Because even if it was, I think, recognized by more countries, like many other countries, it would still have been like that if it was governing itself. So firstly, there are countries that are progressive in terms of governance, and the unique factors about them is, one, their governments are people-centered. It is fundamentally important that a government is people-centered in a way that it values its own people and listens to them, and then it structures its own programming and policy formulation informed by the needs of its own people. Now, there are no people that will not want to have an open civic space, a democratic space, a rule of law sort of space, a space that respects human rights. So when a government is people-centered, it becomes a default factor that these principles will be upheld because people want to be free to speak, people want to be free to assemble, People want to be able to take some action without being repressed on political grounds. So those countries are in place. That's where you look at countries like Somaliland, you talked about, countries like Ghana, you talked about, but even some other countries that are still emerging. Even in East Africa, there are countries that are transitioning to that extent. If you look at countries like Kenya, Kenya just had political issues 2 weeks ago, and they're already thinking about a bipartisan approach to some of these things. And this is something that I find very heartwarming, and that we can say, okay, fine, we are different political parties, but these are issues of our country. Let's approach them together now. That's important. That for me is a transition towards a very interesting means of governing ourselves.
True.
So such states have those unique factors like people-centered leadership. But even secondly, they have an inclusive leadership. What is an inclusive leadership? There are two groups of people that are normally ignored in terms of contribution to political space: the women and the youth.
True.
If you do not include the youth, like we began in our first half of this conversation, the biggest populations in Africa are young people. If the young people cannot be part of governance, then who is governing who? If women, which form the biggest,
majority
for Uganda, I think we are now about 50.6% are women. So the biggest majority of the country's population are women, which population is young, as we all agree. So that means an inclusive government is a unique feature of these progressive countries. And there are those other countries that I still grapple to look for words to use. Very, very sad countries, very undemocratic, very repressive. Countries like Uganda, for example, countries like South Sudan, countries like these Central African countries, the likes of Mali, Algeria, Guinea. These military countries where you just wake up and you are a president because you have a gun. These ones, I don't know where the future is, but the unique features are they are repressive. The governments, the power is consolidated, controlled by individuals through principles that are very non-democratic and very anti-people. The word is anti-people, because I don't even think they need their people. If they were given a chance, they would just exterminate them, and then they exist by themselves, and that's terrible. So I think those two categories of countries in Africa need to agree on how to approach, especially within a global space that is fighting for global dominance. Africa should by now be fighting for a place on the seat at the highest table in terms of global political dominance. But I don't think we are doing that because we don't even know how to govern ourselves first. And that's why everyone is competing for Africa, because we are still being competed for. We are not competing.
True. True.
So yeah, that's that.
Thank you. Fair enough. Andrew, recently in Kenya and Malawi, we saw the Supreme Court annulling elections. We even saw it in Ghana. You're a student of law, and you'll possibly soon enter into practice. I know it is heartwarming when you see that there is respect of rule of law.
Yes.
So what recommendations vis-a-vis the US Africa Summit, what recommendations do you have, or what do you have to speak to the respect of rule of law and for the judiciary of Uganda?
Yes, thank you very much. As you've said, it's very heartwarming when you see that these things are actually happening in Africa. Yes, they're no longer in law, we call it hearsay. Things we just hear about in European countries, we're now seeing them. Yes, and my recommendation, first and foremost, in regards to the rule of law, first of all, we all know the principles of rule of law. Yeah, that is the separation of powers and all that. Yes, so in order to realize that in Uganda here, first and foremost, we must first enforce the principles of the separation of powers, where we are having the executive, parliament, and the judiciary, yes, arms of government, working separately. However, the checks and balances must also be put in place. Yes. Now, the checks and balances being in place doesn't mean that the executive should have an overall check. You get an overall check on the other powers. This must be balanced in order to work hand in hand. You know, too much of anything is always bad, and that is what you have in Uganda. Everything is so much. Yes. So, and by saying that everything is so much, I'm talking about the executive being so much on all the other arms of government. Yes, in Uganda currently we have two big issues that are affecting separation of powers and the rule of law. First and foremost, that by implication, the judiciary also falls in the executive. Yes, and by implication, also Parliament falls in the executive. Why? Because we have the president appointing the Chief Justice. Yes, the current Chief Justice was a former. I shouldn't, and then he worked for the president sometime as a lawyer, something like that, So, and also in Parliament, we have that the majority of the members of Parliament are from the ruling party. Yes, and these are people, sorry to say, that have failed to establish themselves as independent members of Parliament. They, as my colleague has said, they pay allegiance more to the party than to the people who send them to power. So this is my recommendation. The biggest recommendation would first and foremost be that, however much I don't see it happening anytime soon, a recommendation is a recommendation. A recommendation is a recommendation. Yes. Let us try. I can't say us. Even saying us is wrong, because as youth we are not represented anywhere. So let the people in power, or let the people who can, try to first and foremost give us an independent judiciary. Yes, because when you have an independent judicial system, when we have election petitions that we are talking about now, to Ugandans that is hearsay. To Africa it's no longer hearsay, but in Ugandans the hearsay, we just hear about the election petitions, courts throwing out a president due to election irregularities. We shall be able to realize that, because once a petition is brought to court and all the grounds are satisfied successfully, then why shouldn't we throw you out? Why shouldn't we send you back to give us a new election? You get? So with that, we are going to be able to realize maybe something. Yes, like in Kenya, with the constitutional reforms that they had, yes, in 2007, yes, those constitutional reforms are now the fruits that they are benefiting on. We should now move from the table of lamentation and now go to act. Let us act, because at the end of the day, it's us who are going to suffer. Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Andrew, in his submission, he sounds quite pessimistic that it's very impossible to achieve independence of the judiciary in Uganda. And it's quite ironic that you're a student of law. But nonetheless, thank you for your submission. Allow me engage with you, Fred. Garang argues that inclusivity is a factor that is important in it's a factor that's important in successive, or in democracies that are success. And which particular groups of people are we looking at here? We're looking at women, we're looking at the youth, and we're looking at the minorities. Now, Uganda, I'm going to use Uganda because it's one that I'm quite familiar with. Uganda is a country, as Garang said, women constitute around 50.6% of the population, and young people constitute most of the population, right? Now, that being the case, the situation or the status quo doesn't reflect the numbers. We see that the people who lead us are not even close to being youth. We see the people who are on the decision-making table are mostly men and not women. Seeing or looking at those demographics, what recommendations, or how best do you think African countries, particularly Uganda, can possibly uphold the principle of inclusivity for us to achieve this particular aspect of moving towards a democratic state?
Thank you, Douglas. First and foremost, looking at inclusion, allow me put it out that let the inclusion be on the basis
Of merit.
Yes, you want to include women, but which kind of leader are you bringing into a very, very pertinent position of the government? We don't want a leader who is going to handle the pressure of the masses. We want a leader who is going to deliver. We don't want jokers. I think you know the office I'm talking about.
We don't know.
Tell us,
Perhaps. For Ugandan, who is typically Ugandan, they know what I'm talking about. And there are certain positions, like it or not, that would require men because this position will require what we call serious and hard decisions.
Allow me first hold you there. You are arguing, or your argument is one that fosters the patriarchy. You're saying the office, that particular office requires men. We have seen in Tanzania, the biggest office in the land is held by a woman who is delivering far much better than the men that came before her. How do you justify your argument? Because women actually deliver, and they're delivering better than men.
I think depending on my first submission was about on merit. If you remember, Magufuli could not appoint a weak person. So with that, agree with me that Sururu is a very, very strong person, strong woman to manage that country. Are we together?
Yes, we are.
I'm talking about appointing someone because you can in any way or the other affect their decisions. So they are just perpetual. They are just there for the task of being there. So you bring up an IGG, and after some time, she brings out a report and recommendations that what do we have to do? Let us get hold of every government official. Please, as you enter the office, show us what you have. After a certain time, let us review what you have achieved, what you have got. And as you exit the office, let us do another accountability. And someone comes up and says, no, that won't be possible. Why is it like that? For any other person who is strong would have said, let me resign because why would I carry on an office like this? Yet even the powers I'm given to practice, I'm not allowed to put them into control. And someone comes up on public television and says everyone is corrupt. So we should not go for these people. The supreme leader of the land comes up and says corruption is good. But the problem is, if we scare away these corrupt people, they're going to go and invest in other countries. Is that really worthy our thinking, our intelligence? I think we are being taken as a joke. What are the recommendations as regards inclusion? As regards inclusion, we need to get women, we need to get young men, we need to get girls or ladies that can. We pick them on merit. The issue here that is retarding this is that even by refusing to give the civic spaces time and the rights to practice in the country, how are these young ladies and young gentlemen going to be nurtured? We don't want to include into leadership people that are half-baked. Where are these leaders made from? From these civic spaces. Are you getting me? One of the recommendations in order to foster inclusion is to make sure that we give enough comfort to these civic spaces in order to nurture these leaders as they come into power. 2, let us get a difference between feminism and a word I don't want to talk about. Because feminism means we are bringing up these people on merit, showing them that they can, and also giving them a chance to do what? To practice or to be in positions of power. But the rest of just favoring them because we want to include them is not worth risking our nation for that. Another recommendation would be that we have a lot of schools here and there, but the schools are not giving the girl child ample time and space to realize that they can also be somewhere in a strong position. Why am I saying this? Because most of the schools, most of the institutions will uplift the boy child more than the girl child. Even if you give them this small thing of 1 point something in order to be taken to given courses, you are not helping them. How are you going to help them? Help them by putting them on the same level like men. Let them compete ably. Let them come up on merit. Let them show up and fight for these positions. We shall end up with women that can, and we shall include them in our system, just like Sururu of Tanzania. Are we together?
Yes, we are.
I don't think the wife to Mr. Chiza Besigye has been afflicted just on merit, just. I think she has earned it. Rebecca Kadaga, she has earned it.
But I have a question. how can we achieve the meritocracy that you're arguing in a system whereby education is a commodity?
You know, there is a, a gentleman on Twitter, and of course an MP, who was trying to compare university fees and
Secondary education.
kindergarten on these international schools. Find out that at IUIU, I'm paying something like 1.7 as tuition or 2M plus all adds on.
So
And there is an international school, its kindergarten is paying 3.4. Are you getting me?
So does then this bring us back to Garang's argument that a militarized government fosters or thrives on seeing that its citizenry is ignorant?
Of course.
All right.
Why is it like that? Because first of all, I personally, Magala Fred, cannot afford to take my children in a kindergarten of 3.0. I cannot afford to bring my child to a university that pays 5M. What does it mean? Those in power that are corrupt, that have got the money to do nothing, to invest it anywhere, they'll take their kid at that school. And for me, immediately my child gets done with senior food. You know what I'll go to? I'll just get some tailor somewhere. I take my child there.
And that is in the end killing it's killing the activism or the spirit of activism in young people.
That's what I'm trying to tell you.
All
That
right.
these issues of skilling Uganda, what and what, they are trying to let the young ladies settle for less. How many hairdressers do we have in Uganda? And they're saying they're giving us what to do, but they're not empowering the girl child. They are letting the girl child settle for less. Become a tailor. You become, yes, we need them. But can a tailor be appointed a minister? Answer me, please.
Strong question.
Nkumba told us that she used to weave and she used to fish. So yeah.
But you know her education level. I think she was doing it at leisure.
It's okay. All right. Let us stop right there. Allow me to engage with you, Garang. Fred brings out issues that are quite one. If you're to think about it, you may wonder that are we being governed by leaders, or are we just in a state of no leadership? But anyway, that's a question that the viewers out there would ponder about and possibly comment in the comment section. Garang, social movements and protests have been very critical in facilitating democratic processes in Africa, even across the globe. We saw what happened in Nigeria I think a few years ago when young people went on Twitter and they were
2019,
yes, they were engaged in the NSAS campaign. And we also saw what happened in Sudan. Young women are the one who pushed for the overthrow of Umar al-Bashir because of the high cost of living. We see that social movements are quite critical in facilitating democratic processes. My question to you, therefore, is how have citizens, particularly the youth, innovated ways to hold their governments accountable while facing authoritarian regimes?
Okay, so you already spoke about social movements as ways of trying to hold governments to account, but with the increase in our numbers and also the increase in our in access to information and communication media, it has become very easy to say a couple of things that we don't like about how we are governed. So young people have leverage on the use of the internet, and that's why now repressive regimes have seen that internet is a robust area where people can speak against them and they be heard. And you talked about Nigeria. The NSAS campaign is a very interesting case study for how social media and access to the internet is a very interesting tool of democracy in the time we are in. Because what young people simply did is created an hashtag, rose online, and spoke just loudly about it. They used it to rally, to organize rallies, to communicate when the next rally is going to be, to warn themselves actually where the biggest arms of the government are. For example, if there is a truck, normally there used to be a truck around the road that leads to the Independence Ground. When there is truck, people tweet and say, okay, the truck is there, so don't come here. That is just an innovation. So that's what people did. They used it to organize themselves. They used it to push hashtags. They used it to say a lot of things. They flooded the internet. So what did we do as a country? We learned and said, okay, so the internet is becoming a thing. we block the internet during interesting times like elections. So internet alone is an innovation, and it has become an interesting tool in democracy, and that is why in our conversations we advocate for digital rights, so that people should not have the power to limit our access to the internet. Because we noticed that when we go on the streets and protested, we're most likely going to lose lives, and we did that in September of 2020. November, actually, the 18th and 19th of November, yes, we lost lives because people went to the streets and protested because they did not like some things that the government did. So when people can go online, like the Nigerian young people did, and spoke so loudly about the SARS, the SARS arm of the police, and then there were reforms to that extent, that for us is very important as an innovation. But even secondly, also, you notice that the call-out culture is becoming an interesting thing also. On media again, that if there are particular people that have been engaged in things that you know are bad, we saw pictures like people did with the truck, the number plate that trended for the November issue.
Killings, yeah.
People even designed T-shirts with that number plate, the number plate that was seen in the BBC report that went around shooting people at Rampage. People designed T-shirts, they designed artworks and publicized them on social media and told people what exactly had happened. But even secondly, they had pictures of individuals who did those things and publicized them.
But quick question.
So those things are very important, yes.
Do you think, is that enough for military governments or military regimes?
It can never be enough. The only enough thing against the militant is if we are also militant. And that will demand that we arm ourselves, which is something we don't want to do.
True.
We don't want to also arm ourselves because we are dealing with armed people. We just think that they are rational enough to see us on the streets and sit back and say, where is the problem? And then they reinvent how they deal with us. So that is an innovative way that people have decided to use internet for protest. But also even the protests that have come in are also interesting. I saw Kenyan chasing their police. There was a very interesting video of a couple of policemen and a huge crowd of people. They overpowered them and the police took off. This alone shows that when there is discontent, you don't receive oppression. You don't be oppressive to the people that are demonstrating their discontent. You listen to them and engage them at table level. So what that means is our governments should learn that if there is protest, I mean, the existence of protest should be seen as a green sign that the democracy has a problem. And as leaders, we should sit down and evaluate how we approach. But it shouldn't be seen as a threat like what people do in military governments. You see them on the street, you think they're threatening, and you send police. I saw the other day people carrying iron sheets and they were beaten. I remember satirically tweeting that iron sheets have become very humble. They no longer cut people because the way the people dealt with them in that video was sad. So ideally, democracy should see protests as a litmus paper that we have a problem. Let's sit and fix it.
Sure.
So I think those things are very, very important transition to that extent.
All right.
Because I don't want us to reach a situation where people will even fear to go on the street, because that will be the worst we can do. Yeah.
All right. Andrew,
Yes, please.
we're still on the role of social media,
Yes, please.
particularly as an innovative tool in informing democratic process in Africa. Garang used that example of the NSAS campaign that happened in Nigeria.
Okay.
We also have an example of Sudan. We saw what happened to the overthrow of the then president Omar al-Bashir. Because of the high cost of living that were then in Sudan, majority of the protesters then were young ladies who called people up to go and stand against the government, particularly with the use of social media. Now, discuss or assess for us the role of social media, particularly in this 21st century, and if so, whether it is a solution to possibly a tool of accountability for the government.
Thank you very much. Now, the question of social media, it's all a question of how people choose to use it.
Yeah.
Yes, because the fact is that social media is developing so fast. It's developing faster than human beings. Yes, and how we harness this social media or how we harness these technologies and how we use them will all tell how far it's going to take us with it. Yes, I earlier on told you that in Uganda, we have chosen to do what we do with social media. Yes, in a way that I already talked about. In Nigeria, when there was when the SARS and all that was a topic, they used the social media to make sure that people know about it. People come out and they find a way of actually dealing with what was happening. Yes. Now in Uganda, it has been a different case. Yes. There hasn't been so much activism on social media as regards to the things that are oppressing us. Yes. When time for election reaches, let me just give you that example. When time for election in Uganda reaches, in fact, it's abnormal if they don't switch it off. They don't switch off the internet, so you don't access our social media. Yes, it's abnormal. In fact, have they forgotten, or are we really going to vote? You get, because I remember when the Kenyans were going in for their elections and they had internet, it was a joke moving around. How is Kenya's internet still on? You see how funny we are.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
Instead of us going into realization that this can be us. In fact, this has to be us. Yes, we know those are the things that we pick out. So that's what I'm telling you. It's how we choose to take this. Yes. So the role of social media can be a very big one because social media circulates very fast. With just a few MBs, anyone, anywhere can access it and
cause a revolution.
Yes, it can cause a revolution. I can say that it can cause a revolution.
True.
But because we have chosen to use it how we use it, that cannot happen. But it's not yet too late. It's not late. We as Ugandans, if at all these things are happening, maybe it may not be possible for social media to cause a fall of the government in Uganda because of the military regime and how things are handled in Uganda, how differently things are handled in Uganda. Because as I say, for us to overthrow a military regime, we need to get guns, which shouldn't be the case. In fact, we shouldn't even think about it.
Violence.
Yes, because violence is never the answer. We are going to, the country is going to become depreciated more. At the end of yes,
people will lose lives.
Yes, and at the end of the day, even the leader who you put in place may be another one who shall again fight to remove. So we must always take diplomatic means. Yes, and with that, social media should be used. For example, when we had this Iron Sheet saga, yes, social media was supposed to be the first thing that Ugandans use to actually come out and put these people on pressure. If it means them deleting their accounts, let them delete. But we're supposed to put them on pressure, all these arms of government. That is the role of social media.
All right. Yes. All right. Thank you very much. It's unfortunate that I may have to say that we have reached the end of our show. It's quite interesting. And yes, I'm coming to you, Fred. As I engage with you, Fred, you please bring out your arguments and give us your parting shots, as well as all the other panelists. To give us your parting shots and tell the viewers your final, thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. Drake. Preferably, I'd like to add a few things on my brother's submissions. As regards social media, he has well put it out that in Uganda it is not well playing a very big role as regards democracy and also maybe promoting other rights as recommended in the summit's report. But I think there are some people that we cannot just look at and leave it out unsaid. If you look at cartoonists, just like Dr. Spire, he will put out something in a funny stature,
sarcastic manner,
but it is communicating a lot. Putting out a father and a son in a pamper, and someone on Twitter, a little flies, but of course a person who understands will add up the communication and know what he's meaning. We have different professors via there who always come up, and for example, Dr. Sarah, she comes out and tweets something that is always reasonable. We have different scholars, law students, that will always come and tweet about what is going on. Trust me, for the last 2 weeks, Twitter has been full of the Iron Sheet saga. Trust me, those people that are being suspected and those ones that did it have not been safe. There is a trending small publication by, I think, a secondary student of Kampala ISS, literally having a skit, having a publication out of New Vision and Daily Monitor talking about the Anshit saga. What does it mean? It means that social media is playing a very big role as regards the implementation, as well as regarding the communication, telling us information, what is happening, where I am not. Trust me, have you noticed that on statuses, we literally get to know that the police is not delivering somehow? How? The police will definitely put out a certain clip showing how accidents are happening and they will caution you. But as the public, we are now rethinking, is it worth it just showing us the video? Is the police saying we the citizens are accountable? Yet the fault, if you look at the fault, it is because of the road. The road has been full of water because it has rained. It means the infrastructure is poor. Service delivery is not okay. So there is a check always as regards social media to the implementation of policies and also the infringement on human rights. We have seen the boys that were beaten up because of their political affiliations. It is a caution to the rest of the youth. So thank you very much, Mr. Drake. Lastly, I'm Magala Fred, still from Islamic University in Uganda, a law student, third year. I'm very pleased that you always call me through to talk about important matters regarding my nation and regarding the state of the human rights, most especially democracy, because as my co-panelist said, we shall not always go for violence, because with violence we shall even lose more. Just look at Libya. So as we come into these spaces, we realize that we have a much more bigger role to play in the development of our nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Garang Lester, your parting shot, sir.
Thank you, Douglas. It's been a pleasure to speak about democracy, rule of law, and human rights within the context of our countries. And I am always honored to appear to speak about such things. My final things that I want to tell people is that we as people, we have a responsibility that even if we are not in leadership to the extent that we can make binding decisions in policy, I think as citizens, we have a responsibility and we need to exercise that responsibility in a rational manner. Yes, we can hold government to account, but also how do we hold government to account? Government are also people with emotions and people with reactions. It is bad to provoke power because when power reacts, you lose. So I want us to be rational in how we hold power to account, and I want us to be very intentional in the things that we do. If you have been to a school, you have been to a university like all of us in this panel, we have a heavier burden to point out the ills within our leadership, even if it means sacrificing sometimes some of our rights. What that means is do not fear that you will be oppressed. Do your responsibility as a citizen and then wait for what happens next. People have been put to jail, people have been taken in drones, but at the end of the day, it is your responsibility as a citizen. Plato said that the biggest problem, the biggest reason why you will be ruled by people that are insufficient is if you fail to engage in politics. By tweeting about the things that are wrong with the government, by trying to hold government to account, you're participating in how you're governed, and you will have executed your responsibility. Don't keep quiet. Thank you.
Thank you. Powerful. Andrew, your parting shot, sir.
Yes, first and foremost, thank you very much for having me here once again. It's always it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad that I have this chance or privilege to talk about such pertinent issues that, you know. My parting shot would be that, first of all, it's not late. Yes, it's not late. It would be very bad. It would be very, very, very bad and saddening to our hearts if at all we repeated the same mistakes that we are complaining about. Yes, we as upcoming leaders, we as aspiring or student leaders, there are certain things we must do in order to avoid some things from happening again. The leaders we are currently having were once student leaders, and from that is what they grew into national leadership. Yes. However much you say that these people are not leaving power, or they are failing to leave their power, one day, one time will come and they will go, and it will be now us who are complaining about these things that will come up. And if we come up and repeat the same mistakes, then the time we're spending here talking about these things would have been wasted. Yes? And the other thing, maybe before we talk about things that are to happen in the future, let's talk about now as I conclude. Again, it's not late for the government agencies to act the way they act. To stop acting the way they act. It's not so late for them to give us the leadership that we deserve. It's not so late for them to include the youth who are going to take up national leadership at a later stage to give us these opportunities. Yes, because if the military, if the army woke up and it actually did what's supposed to do, that is to protect us. Yes, and stop going on streets and beating up people who are peacefully protesting, which is their right. Yes, then this country would at least move half a step or a step further. You get? So if at all the youth regained hope, yes, and started participating in civic space and using the internet and all those other platforms as they're supposed to, it will be a step, though it may not be realizable right now, but it will be a step. So my parting shot is that we as the youth, let us start doing what is required of us. We have a social responsibility. We don't owe it to anyone. We have a social responsibility to do some of the things that we're supposed to do the right way. Because if we don't do them, it's going to come back and it's going to affect us. Yes? So let us be the change that we want in all our respect. Not all of us can be leaders. Not all of us can actually, be where we have to be in order to implement. But we can do certain things that are going to implement change. One, by putting the right leaders into power. Secondly, by avoiding some of the things that we do, the normalization of all these bad things corruption and all those other things. So that would be my call to my fellow youths, and there is hope. There is hope. Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'm always honored and privileged to have a very interesting panel such as today. It has been one that has dissected this topic and brought out the bad and the good at the same time. Looking at the downside, we look at the trajectory that Africa has moved. And it's sad to say that we are not yet there. But the positive is we have seen examples from countries like Kenya, Ghana, Somaliland, among others, that are trying to take the right path. So my call out to you all is continue watching Civic Space TV. We are privileged and we are humbled that you have stayed with us up to this time. Stay with us again next week, same time, same place. Thank you very much.